Hey everybody, it's Phil Struzula from Select Software Reviews, and we're back honoring another HR Tech Award winner recipient. This is a really interesting case study, in my opinion, on how to use technology through a time of rapid growth. And specifically, we're talking about a company that grew rapidly throughout the pandemic. Ellie Angell is with us from my interview. And Ellie, you're nominating Mark Jenkins, who is the head of talent acquisitions for the operations group at Ocado. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. That's correct.
Awesome. And do you mind just giving us like the headline on like why are you nominating Mark and his team? Kind of what happened at a high level?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, it's a pleasure to speak. So thank you so much for having us on. The reason why we're nominating Mark is because the pandemic was a really challenging time for everyone. And what Ocado is an online retailer, basically. So when it came to the pandemic, they had a really huge demand increase. And Mark was fast on his feet. He is an innovator, and he quickly was able to implement a whole change in structure, change in the whole recruitment process for his operational roles, which led to a huge amount of time saving, cost saving, and most importantly, 4,300 new hires in 6 months.
Wow, that's crazy. And
Yeah.
like how big is Ocado in general and like what does Mark's team kind of look like?
So Ocado is the world's largest online grocery. They essentially, so they're like a supermarket, a regular supermarket, but everything is online. So instead of you going into the store and you buying things, Ocado had this really innovative approach where they were just going to have warehouses and delivery drivers, and of course all the other background operations that comes with running such a big giant like that. And I think the just to give you an idea of the size, so before the pandemic, they were receiving 1,500 applications a week for their delivery driver and warehouse operation roles.
Okay, sounds good. And what exactly did they do to sort of restructure the recruitment process and how did they leverage HR technology to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So before the pandemic, they had about 1,500 sort of applications per week. Now, this is a huge company, so it takes a lot of people to do the manpower behind everything. Now, in the early weeks of March, as I'm sure you probably remember, a lot of the supermarkets, people were not able, or they were less wanting to leave their homes, and a lot of people turned to online shopping. So at the same time, of course, a lot of people unfortunately were losing their jobs. So their applications rose from around 1,500 per week to 3,500 over one weekend. And not only did they have that many applications, but they also had a huge demand in growth. And so they needed to recruit people, and they needed to recruit people quickly. What had been, I believe, a sort of lengthy 5-stage process. So that had included application, then a telephone screen, and then a couple of days later, it included a sort of 1 hour face-to-face interview, which meant they were getting through around 50 applications a week. Now, that was just not going to cut it for the rise in demand. So Mark sort of looked at a couple of different ways in which he could streamline the process. And something that quite gladly came out on top was video interviewing, and one-way video interviewing, in the hopes to be able to determine the most suitable candidates, make sure that they were also aware about the role, and also to sort of fast forward them to the hired stage as quickly as possible.
Got it. Yeah, I remember on our site, we saw an increase in demand for video interviewing of, I think it was like 520% month over month in the early days of the pandemic. And it sounds like Mark was one of those people who was like, oh, wow, like how do we kind of cope with this new normal? And then in his case, also ridiculous amount of growth.
Yeah.
Um, what do you think are the specific things that that team did that really got the most out of this sort of technology from a recruiter or candidate perspective, or maybe a process perspective?
Absolutely. So the first thing I think is that Mark basically looked at all the different areas. So he didn't just look at one area in isolation. He looked at all the different ways in which he could streamline and be able to sort of meet the goals and get more sort of people hired sooner rather than later. And Locado actually runs off a group of values. And one of the most important values was also to make sure that even with this increased growth, they were not going to in any way detriment the candidate experience. So essentially the way that they handled, the way they introduced this one-way sort of video interviewing to their candidates, they actually had a handy guide which went out to the candidates. So everything was very transparent. All the candidates knew exactly what was to be expected of them and how the best that they could do these video interviews. So for instance, he made sure they had a candidate branded portal. So when the candidate came on, they saw Ocado with some nice images. Another thing that he also looked at was the process itself, and especially the sort of more lengthier parts of the process. So one of the things, especially with delivery drivers, is that they work in shift patterns. And what that means is that typically the recruiter works 9 till 5. That's not when the people they were trying to telephone into work. So what they were able to do is essentially have the application a lot more accessible. So with one-way video interviewing, of course, you can do this anytime. You can do it on your mobile, you can do it on your desktop, and actually they saw around 63% of their applications come through on mobile. And what that did is that actually allowed more time for the hiring managers to process these videos and go through them and make decisions. So it also completely standardizes the process. And they set up their interviews so that candidates were able to complete from start to finish in under 15 minutes. So not only was it a benefit to Ocado and to their recruitment process, but it also was a much easier application process for the candidates themselves as well.
Wow, that's awesome. And I know you've sort of shared a lot of the like stats and numbers throughout the this conversation, but like what were some of the sort of results, and how did this enable, I guess, the business to grow during this crazy time?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mark is, I'm sure he will not mind me saying, he's a very data-driven man. And actually, one of the things that we did is we shifted and we actually worked on our analytics at the same time. And it's because of those analytics that Mark was able to share some pretty impressive sort of results. So firstly, I think the main result is that in 6 months, they were able to hire 4,300 new permanent staff, which is a huge achievement, especially in the middle of a global pandemic. Other sort of good results is one thing, you know, it's very easy to see the qualitative benefits of video interviewing, you know, but maybe what's less transparent sometimes is the quantitative. So they used to have 33% no-shows, which I'm sure every recruitment professional will be able to sort of understand. And they actually eradicated all no-shows because it was a one-way interaction. Of course, there's no show. If no one shows, then they're not in the process anymore. That, of course, saves a lot of time. Other sort of results that they had, so they moved from a 5-step, as I said, very lengthy, administrative heavy process. They were able to reduce that to 3 days from point of application to hire. So that's a really, really fast turnaround. Another thing that Mark did himself is that he did a bit of an internal review, as any sort of responsible head of department would. And the results were great, actually. 94% of the hiring managers would give my interview 4 or 5 stars. And 90% of them had said, actually, this was not just the current normal, it was going to be the new normal and the new forever. So 90% of them actually would have preferred, are still using my interview post-pandemic as well. So there was some great results, not just in terms of those 4,300 people getting jobs and being able to get jobs very quickly when a lot of the world was sort of falling apart, but also in terms of the hiring managers and their sort of happiness in their sort of streamlined processes and work as well.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Like my next question was just going to be like, this is obviously a very unique time that hopefully we will not experience again for a very, very long time as human beings. But I wonder, you know, sort of post pandemic, post this like absurd hyper growth moment of their company, are they going to continue to use video interview? And it sounds like from the, you know, the hiring manager company perspective, the answer is overwhelmingly, yeah, we should be doing this. And I think the numbers sort of prove out from a time saving perspective, as well as just an experience perspective, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. What I would say is that I think a lot of people, video interviewing is definitely on the rise. It's not something that everyone has done, but last year made video normal. They made it acceptable. Made it acceptable to have meetings in our living rooms, and none of that was normal before. So it's the same with video. That when a process, there can be a lot of change management and things like that, and what can seem scary can actually be very, very implemented very, very simply. And when people sort of see how quickly, so we were able to get the account set up in 3 days with a branded experience, everything working, managers hiring, candidates coming through. So I think it's one of those things that when you start using it, you actually understand all the benefits. And very little do I hear people saying, no, I'm just going to go back to the regular CV and do things the old time lengthy way. So yeah, they're definitely still using the account. I'm pleased to say the account's growing and moved into other parts of the business as well. So it's been good all round.
That's wonderful. And especially if you can get something set up even for a large company in 3 days, it's pretty amazing. I guess looking back on their whole journey, are there any other sort of last key takeaways that you think TA recruiting HR professionals should know about when maybe they're thinking about following in Mark's footsteps and think that video interviewing might be interesting, or just in general around how this team was able to move quickly, any like key learnings for other professionals that are trying to do something similar, change management perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that the best advice I could say is just make sure you're thinking of everyone involved. So not just the hiring managers, but also the candidates and making sure that they have a really good experience too. We like to keep things simple, and we allow sort of people to brand it up in their own brands, introduction videos and all those things. And although those things are optional, it's definitely a huge, we see huge improvements in candidate engagement rates when they are used. So make sure your candidates, when they're sort of in the process, they're enjoying using the process, and you can actually use it to give a lot of more information as well. And also with the hiring managers. So just to make sure that everyone has their sort of key questions. So it's very good way to get really key insights into your candidates. But make sure you're getting the best of it. And sort of, I would say it's best to keep it sort of 4 to 6 questions, 1 minute answering time. And that way, it's short and nice and simple for your candidate to complete, for your hiring team to review, and for the final decision makers to review as well. And that's my best takeaway is just keep it simple and make sure it's also nice for the candidate as well as the managers.
Great advice. And as a quick side note, I remember my first introduction to video interviews maybe 12 years ago. And I remember the company that was doing them had an option, we'll send you a webcam, which is insane. And now
Yeah,
you're saying over half of people are just doing it on their phones because we carry around these, amazing cameras. And we're also used to being on camera now through our social and professional lives. So thanks again for sharing the story. Congrats to Mark and the Ocado team. And I hope that everybody listening was able to learn something from this really interesting case study.
thank you so much, and thanks so much for having me. It's been great.